Hey guys, it's Chelsea from The Financial Diet, and this week's video is brought to you by Advisor.com. We're more than halfway through the year, which means many of us are taking stock of the financial goals we set back in January, including what we can do now to make sure we stay on track through the end of the year. If you've been thinking of utilizing the services of a financial professional, the TFD community has been loving Advisor.com. Getting to work with a living, breathing financial advisor has historically been out of reach for people with less than $250,000 in the bank, despite the fact that many of life's meaningful financial moments happen way before reaching that financial milestone. Robo-advisors have tried to fill that gap, and while they can be helpful depending on your situation, there really is no replacement for one-on-one guidance and connections. Advisor.com provides their clients with a top-notch advising team for a fixed, flat annual fee. If you have money resolutions for 2023 and are feeling motivated to make positive changes, think of them as your financial accountability partner. Their team of advisors work for you, not commissions, and will help you to achieve your smart financial goals through planning, investing, tax strategizing, and more. Schedule a free consultation call with Advisor.com today at Advisor.com and start getting on track to reach your goals for 2023 and beyond. And this week we're talking about being hot as and why it's actually not a vibe. More to the point, we're going to be talking about the economics of pretty privilege, the good, the bad, and the, you guessed it, ugly. So for those who haven't been aware, there's been a bit of a discourse happening on places like TikTok around the downsides of being hot. I actually made a TikTok responding to one of these and sharing my own personal views on the subject, including an anecdote from when I actually dated someone years ago who was, I think, pretty objectively an extremely, extremely hot person. Now, I do think that my husband today is an absolutely beautiful man, but this person was like a part-time model and was the kind of beautiful that gets you like stopped in the street and given free things, which for a man is a pretty unusual level of beauty. And in my TikTok talking about the downsides of being pretty, I mentioned the fact that I tend to believe, and the research that I did for this video does seem to back it up, that there's a bit of a bell curve when it comes to attractiveness, and that while being attractive, or more to the point, not unattractive, can confer a lot of benefits, being insanely over-the-top attractive can actually start to have a lot of drawbacks. And I'll never forget that my boyfriend at the time once told me, he was about 30 at the time, so at an age where he was starting to feel the most intense, youth-oriented form of his beauty start to fade, that going through life with fading extreme beauty was like having someone very slowly turn off a light around you, which was really sad to me at the time and still feels sad, but is also totally understandable as a phenomenon because if you've sort of been moving through the world in a falsely inflated way and it starts to become a more realistic version of itself, that would probably feel like a light being shut off. So although many people were making fun of the TikToks of beautiful people talking about how hard it is to be beautiful, I actually found myself really empathizing with them in a lot of ways and remembering just how much it stuck with me when I was up close and personal with someone having that experience, especially as they aged. But I also understand why the idea of complaining about how hard it is to be hot could be pretty galling to some people, because what is undeniable is that a certain level of beauty, or again, absence of ugliness, does confer huge benefits. And at the same time that people have been complaining about the downsides of being pretty, other viral TikToks have talked about what it was like to go from being perceived as not attractive by society to being perceived as attractive. From an article in the New York Post, one influencer shared about the reality of becoming pretty. Quote, "The beauty shared an old photo that showed her at 257 pounds when she claimed that she rarely received any perks. These days, however, Keels claims that she benefits from her beauty every single day in a variety of ways. As she explained in a viral video, it can be subtle things you wouldn't notice. Not being charged for that extra drink or dessert at a restaurant, or having someone offer to put the air in your tires instead of seeing you struggle doing it." And that's obviously anecdotal, but what's not anecdotal is the massive ways in which being attractive impacts our social, professional, and financial outcomes. I've always been kind of surprised as someone who does a lot of sociological and cultural commentary how attractiveness really rarely gets addressed as an axis of privilege when in many ways it's one of the most acute ones in terms of the material benefits that it can have on our life. And part of that I think is because A, what is considered attractive really varies culture to culture. For example, in the US, it's very tied up with things like whiteness, thinness, etc. but also because beauty is ultimately very subjective. It's quite frankly a bit off-putting to hear people identify themselves as being a member of the attractive community, even if most would objectively say that that's true. And it's also not a static identity. Attractiveness can vary depending on a ton of factors, but in many cases most acutely with age, meaning that even the most attractive people at a given point in their life are likely to not be considered conventionally attractive at some point. So as an identity and as a form of privilege, it's less static and more subjective than many other axes. But to me, it's a hugely missed opportunity to never discuss and analyze the benefits of attractiveness the way we do the benefits of other identities, because again, the difference that it makes in people's lives can be huge. As one Vice article puts it, throughout the world, attractive people show greater acquisition of resources and greater reproductive success than others, says one study. In another study from 2009, 284 subjects rated photographs of people according to how likable, attractive, and trustworthy they perceived the person in the photographs to be. Results showed that attractive individuals were deemed more trustworthy than unattractive individuals. And a lot of the benefits tend to break down along gender lines, with different aspects of attractiveness being valuable to different genders. When it comes to men, for example, few things have quite as much impact as being tall, or more to the point, not being tall. Quote, the relationship between height and earnings is nonlinear for American men. Being an inch shorter than average correlates with annual earnings of about 5% lower, but being an inch taller than average does not have much impact, though men who are about 4 or more inches taller than average earn slightly more. There are not many gains to being tall, but there is a clear penalty to shortness. The shorter men are relative to average, the less they earn. Men more than 20% shorter than average, 66 inches or less, earn at least 10% less. Short women also earn less, but they face smaller wage penalties, about half the magnitude of short men. But tall women do out-earn their peers. Each extra inch of female height adds about 1% more in earnings. The economists, who controlled for ethnicity and other complicating factors, estimate that non-short people tend to work in skilled jobs that pay more and have more education. Short Americans are also more likely to be in poor health and to live in poverty. And from another article, quote, in fact, Malcolm Gladwell in his best-selling book Blink takes this argument to another level. I polled about half the companies on the Fortune 500 list, asking each company questions about its CEO. In my sample, I found that average CEOs were just a shade under 6 feet. Given that the average American male is 5 foot 9 inches, that means that CEOs as a group have about 3 inches on the rest of their sex. But this statistic actually understates matters. In the US population, about 14.5% of all men are 6 feet or over. Among CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, that number is 58%. Even more strikingly, in the general American population, 3.9% of adult men are 6 foot 2 or taller. But among my CEO sample, 30% were 6 foot 2 or taller. So it's undeniable that certain markers of attractiveness confer huge benefits financially and professionally. And as I mentioned, it also generally leads to people ascribing you better characteristics that have nothing to do with attractiveness, like being more trustworthy, likable, etc. And this isn't shocking when we consider just how much this association between attractiveness and worthiness is ingrained into us even as children. For example, it's pretty much common knowledge by now, but when we look at children's entertainment, like Disney movies, etc., it's usually the case that the protagonist, the love interest, the hero, the princess are all beautiful, while often the villains are defined by their physical unattractiveness. And sometimes the connection between being unattractive and being evil is made explicit and direct. These characters are ugly because they're evil, and their outward appearance is a reflection of their unworthy interiors. But one of the interesting questions about pretty privilege is whether or not some of the benefits that develop as a result of this attractiveness is because of the attractiveness itself, or because of this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy of how more attractive people are treated, essentially from birth. Quote, there's a link between attractiveness and extracurricular high school activities, such as varsity sports and student government. These activities may help develop skills that are valued in adult labor markets, and attractiveness is also positively correlated with proxy measures of confidence, one channel emphasized in the experimental labor market paper of Mobius and Rosenblatt, and with some of the so-called Big Five personality traits, particularly extroversion and the absence of neuroticism. The measures of high school experience, confidence, and personality, however, have little effect on the magnitude of attractiveness premium when WLS respondents are in their mid-30s and early 50s. Our evidence is consistent with the idea that attractiveness is an intrinsically productive attribute in early and mid-career labor markets, distinct from skills acquired in high school, personality traits, and cognitive ability. So long story short, there is some conflicting data on whether or not the attractiveness from inception leads people to develop traits that are beneficial to them, or that attractiveness just always allows them to be perceived in a more positive way. Anyone who's seen 30 Rock, for example, will remember the infamous Bubble episode with Jon Hamm that deals with some of the potential downsides of being perceived as hyper-attractive all your life, despite your actual competency or merit. But we'll get into that a bit later. But whether or not the attractiveness privilege is more of a nature or nurture question, what does seem to be clear is that in our society, there's more of a direct penalty for being considered unattractive than there is a privilege for being considered pretty. Essentially, we've kind of created a situation where being attractive is almost considered the baseline, and people who are not attractive enough are viewed as falling short of that unspoken metric. Taking it back to media, for example, it's not terribly surprising that our standards of attractiveness would be very high, so much so that unattractive people are punished in comparison, when attractiveness, and perhaps more importantly youth, are considered a standard across almost all of the media we consume. Quote, Mocan and Teakin in 2010 emphasized that for females, ugliness may be a hindrance rather than beauty being valuable. They write, quote, the level of beauty in high school has an effect on criminal propensity 7 or 8 years later, which seems due to the impact of the level of beauty on human capital formation. And Hammermesh and Biddle also note that while attractive people are paid more, the premia for good looks are considerably smaller than the penalties for bad looks, and they are not statistically significant. So overall, the data does seem to paint a picture that there is a window of attractiveness in which it's not necessarily hyper-beneficial, but you are also not being punished or penalized or facing obstacles because of that lack of attractiveness. However, there is some data to suggest that there are diminishing returns when it comes to our levels of attractiveness, and that being the kind of hyper-attractive that I talked about at the beginning of the video can actually present a lot of downsides. Again, one of the reasons why those seemingly obnoxious TikToks about how hard it is to be pretty don't actually bother me that much. From an article in spring.org, although attractive, pretty, and beautiful people are generally more popular socially, there is some evidence that very attractive people can experience social rejection from members of their own sex. And people in relationships also tend to protect themselves from beauty by ignoring it. Research shows that when we're thinking about love, we automatically ignore attractive members of the opposite sex, probably to protect our feelings about our own long-term partner. And while it can't be overstated that people of all conventional levels of attractiveness can experience harassment and unwanted attention in the workplace, there is also compelling data to suggest that very attractive women in particular can be penalized in the workplace for their extreme attractiveness. That can manifest in a lot of things like being propositioned for romantic interludes, not being taken seriously by superiors, being penalized by other women, or just generally having a perception that they are in the position they're in professionally because of their attractiveness and their sex appeal rather than their actual merit. And while this is obviously an unfair judgment to put on anyone, what's unfortunate is that in some cases, that perception that a person is in a position because of attractiveness and not merit, and they're living in that hot person bubble, that a person is in a given position because of attractiveness and not merit, can actually sometimes be true. From a BBC article. To psychologists, this is called the what is beautiful is good heuristic, but fans of the sitcom 30 Rock might recognize this as the bubble. Jon Hamm's character is remarkably incompetent, yet manages to live in blissful self-delusion thanks to his good looks. As a doctor, for example, he can't even perform the Heimlich maneuver, but somehow managed to drift through medical school thanks to his natural charm. According to the available evidence, the bubble is a reality. In education, for instance, Walker and Freevert found a wealth of research showing that better-looking students at school and university tend to be judged by teachers as being more competent and intelligent, and that was reflected in the grades that they gave them. What's more, the bubble's influence inflates over the years. There's a cumulative effect, explains Freevert. You become more confident and have more positive beliefs and more opportunities to demonstrate that competence. And when it comes to potential downsides of beauty, there are even really worrying ones when it comes to things like medical care that more attractive people might receive. From that same article, more worryingly, being beautiful or handsome could harm your medical care. We tend to link good looks to health, meaning that illnesses are often taken less seriously when they affect the good-looking. When treating people for pain, for instance, doctors tend to take less care over more attractive people. Now, I don't say all of this to say that pretty privilege isn't still real. As we've discussed, it is, and there are huge ways that it impacts people. But when you look at the data as a whole, it seems more clear that we are punished for being unattractive rather than rewarded for being pretty. This is still obviously a form of attractive privilege, and similar to other axes of privilege, creates a situation where you are considered the default, and people who don't live up to that standard are considered the problem. But before we're so quick to dismiss people who might point out some of the downsides of being attractive, especially extremely attractive, it's important to remember that those downsides are real, and especially for women can be very difficult to deal with as we discussed before, that perceived beauty will inevitably fade with time. Even the most attractive woman at 25 will eventually not be perceived at that same level of attractiveness by the time she reaches 55 or 65 or beyond. So you're essentially starting a game on ultra easy mode and then progressively moving to hard as you go, often not having developed the skills necessary to compensate for that innate privilege. Long story short, the economics of being pretty are complicated, but what's very clear is that what you look like has much more of an impact on your life than any of us would probably like to admit. And now it's time for our TFD Society member questions of the week. Reminder that amongst all of the other perks you get by joining at the join button below or at our Patreon, you also get to ask me questions every week that I will answer on my videos. Let's get into them. The first question says, I'd love to learn more about investing in startups and small businesses. I've seen a lot of websites popping up that host investor meetings, small businesses, similar to Kickstarter, where a small business pitches you to try to buy their product. I'm a total newbie, but would love to hear your thoughts on this. In general, my thoughts on this are that it's a very, very volatile type of investment. And usually when you're considering investing in something like a small business, it should be more for like ethical reasons or creative reasons, or because you want to see that business thrive or want to see more businesses like that in the world. But it really generally shouldn't be looked at as a financial opportunity because it is so high risk. So in general, I would advise against using more of like 10% of your investable income to go toward that kind of an investment, and really treat it as though you're going to a casino and don't necessarily expect to see returns on it and are doing it for other reasons besides the financial ones. Can you share your thoughts on the Supreme Court affirmative action decision? I would love to see a video on that. So we will do a video on this. For those who are not familiar, here's a quick headline on what happened with the Supreme Court decision on affirmative action, which is essentially going to have a trickle-down effect of dismantling affirmative action throughout the country. I'll go into more detail in the video, obviously, but in general, what I think about these kind of issues are that we live in a supremely unfair society where benefits and wealth and privilege are conferred on a relatively small group of people. And when it comes to things like, for example, wealth inequality, inherited wealth, etc., the privileges of nepotism and networking and connections, we tend to totally ignore those and to not be offended by them, but are deeply offended anytime someone from a lower income or a more marginalized community gets anything perceived as an outsized advantage. Like, we're not rallying against people who get into Harvard because they're a legacy whose father donated a library to the college. We're offended by the person who might have gotten in with a slightly lower test score because they are from a historically marginalized community. We're not upset at wealthy people taking private jets twice a week to go visit their friends and party in Aspen. But we are offended at the idea that a working single mother on food stamps might get a little bit extra money one month to be able to take her kids to the movies. So in general, I think it's just really indicative of a terrible trend that we have in how we perceive privilege and advantages in this country. And yeah, it's really disheartening, but I'll do a video on it. As always, guys, thanks for watching, and don't forget to